I mean, that's how I can tell you that's how most countries in Asia, especially the ASEAN countries, would view it. They would view it as a very provocative move. And frankly, this is where, in a sense, one contemporary issue that, of course, is related to Taiwan, at least symbolically or metaphorically, is what's happening in Ukraine. Many people in the United States say that if the United States doesn't stand up to Russia in Ukraine, this is going to open up the possibility of China invading Taiwan, which I think is a completely wrong analogy because, Ukraine is an independent, sovereign country that is recognized as one by the United Nations. And Taiwan is not an independent, sovereign country that is recognized by the United Nations as an independent state. So it's a very, very different situation. I'm going to sort of ask a question about the Ukraine war and how do you think that will play out? Because it's quite clear there is now a divergence in many ways between what the West is expecting in Ukraine. The West sees Ukraine as a black and white issue that, it's good versus evil. The West combined Europe and US against Russia. But what's significant is that if you look at the list of the combined population of the countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia, it makes up only 15% of the world's population. 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia. And indeed, as you can see from the visit of Foreign Minister Lavrov to Africa that is going on as we speak, that a lot of African countries are still keeping their doors open to Russia, as indeed are many Asian countries too. So in that sense, how do you think the Ukraine war affects, in a sense, Americans' views towards the rest of the world? How will it affect, for example, their views of Asia?
I think the interesting thing here is the seesawing of American perceptions of how the war is going. For example, in the beginning, American leaders felt that Russia had made a big blunder, which, by the way, it was a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity.
Absolutely.
It was...
it's illegal. The invasion is illegal.
Illegal invasion. And I think the UN votes have reflected that, UNGA, very clearly. So that is without debate. But I think there was a sense that in terms of the military aspects, that this war is going very badly for Russia in terms of the way it stumbled in the first weeks. Could not capture Kiev. It suffered many losses. The Ukrainians put up a very brave, courageous resistance.
Absolutely.
This was certainly seen as a way perhaps this invasion can be reversed. What's happening now is something more gray, where the Russians have given up on their, it seems, although I read very recently that there was some mixed signaling from Sergei Lavrov, but generally it seems that Russia is focusing on the East. And the other problem is that one impact of this war is significantly higher inflation. And this inflation is being exported back to the West. So the longer this war goes on, the more is the pain felt, not just by Russians, Ukrainians, of course, the most, but also by Americans. And the average American doesn't have a lot of savings. The upper middle class does well, but your very average American lives from paycheck to paycheck often. So this inflation is bad for the people in the United States. And so a prolonged conflict is not in the interests of the US, never mind Ukraine and Europe. And this is where the question arises that, coupled with the fact that any conflict, whether it, God forbid, happens in Taiwan, would have an even greater impact on inflation, because China, as we know, and Taiwan indeed, are deeply woven much more into the global supply chains.
Absolutely.
So can the US...
You can't buy an Apple phone if there's no trade between US and China.
That's right. That's right. So indeed, the US and Chinese economies are complementary. If you look at the terms of trade, it's a mutually beneficial dynamic for the most part, with some significant issues. So I would say that the Ukraine war very tragically should lead to some learnings, if there's a silver lining in this. One is that the rest of the world, as you pointed out very well, the rest of the world, the global south, is not interested in taking sides.
Including good friends like India, for example.
Absolutely. On Russia, India has taken a very different position. While not being thrilled about the violations of territorial integrity that have happened, the United States has a system of alliances and partnerships, but this is not like the Cold War. In the Cold War, allies and partners typically fell in line to their patrons. Even there, by the way, there were divergences. For example, Ostpolitik was an initiative that opened the way for détente. But today, it's much more true. Today, allies from Turkey to Thailand are close friends of the US. They have no problem with the United States. In the case of Thailand, it's a very active partner. But it does not mean they're going to sign on to every sanction and every policy that the US pursues. And so this should be a message not just to Russia, but to the United States as well, in terms of what a future crisis over Taiwan could mean and why it is so important to avoid that crisis, avoid the conditions that can create such a crisis.
You're absolutely right. And maybe I can just inject a question on Europe. In many ways, on the Ukraine issue, Europe could have played the role of a bridge builder to try and, in a sense, explain to people in Washington, D.C., it's not the best thing in the world to try and humiliate Russia, which is, by the way, what George Kennan advised, which is what Henry Kissinger advised. And Henry Kissinger himself had a very good formula in 2014 on how to preserve peace in Ukraine. He says, Ukraine should be completely independent, free to join the European Union, but Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. And even a simple assurance like saying Ukraine should not join NATO would have solved half the problem. But that was an assurance that the United States was, for whatever reason, reluctant to give. And I would say in many ways, the Europeans could have been peacemakers on the Ukraine issue, but they have actually failed. How do you assess the European record on this subject?
Well, Europe has largely, Europe and US policies on Russia have largely been aligned practically entirely. Well, there are exceptions, of course, like Hungary and a couple of others. I don't know if this can be sustained in the case of this particular question. We are not talking now of allies like Turkey, who were never with the US. Turkey is a NATO ally, by the way. People forget these days. The fact that people forget itself tells you something. But I suspect that if this war goes on, not for weeks or a few months longer, but a year or more, then there will be European leaders who will start doing the math and may start looking for a diplomatic settlement out of it. What the terms should be, of course, can only be decided by, most importantly, Ukrainians. But nevertheless, the prioritization of diplomacy as a path, rather than saying, let this continue till Russia is defeated, which it is unlikely to be defeated. And if it is, by the way, the implications may not be so pretty for security in Europe. If, let's say, Russia is defeated in terms of a regime change or something of that sort. So the lessons for Asia are that I think Asian allies may find it productive to have these quiet conversations with Washington before a crisis occurs, God forbid, and try to be bridges. For example, South Korea has a staunch US ally, a close friend of the United States, regardless of administration there, but has a nuanced view on China.
And has been invited to join the Quad.
Has been,
which would make, if South Korea joins the Quad, you got to call it the Squad,
right? But maybe for that reason alone.
So far, South Korea has, for whatever reason, decided not to join the Quad. I mean, they may do so eventually, but they're holding back for the obvious reason that South Korea needs China's cooperation on North Korea, to put it very simply.
It does.